Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Poema podcast. I am James Prescott, your host. Welcome back to the show. Great to have you all here again. And it's another great episode we've got lined up today. It's the third part of our series that we're doing on superhero grief, I would say, and modern superheroes of modern mythology, and just what we can learn from these characters about how we process grief. And joining me today again, it's my honor to have Amanda Held Opelt. Welcome back.
Thank you. I'm glad to be back.
Yeah, it's really great to have you here. And you're going to be interviewing me today to a certain extent. So,
well, yes, because here comes the part of the podcast where I once again admit to you that I am woefully ill prepared for this discussion because have I watched any episodes? So if you've listened, listeners, a word for the listeners. If you have listened to any of the other podcasts James and I have done about superheroes, you know that I am not a person who has had a history of interest in the genre of superhero. That I'm like more of like a history, like movies about history are kind of my thing. And so in following James on Twitter, he is the singular person who has ever gotten me remotely interested in the genre of superheroes. And so he's basically preparing me for when my children start going to sleep at night and I can start watching movies and TV again. He is laying groundwork for me to be prepared to engage with this genre, particularly the avenue of grief, what they have to say about grief. So that is what this is. This podcast series is educating Amanda about the deeper levels of human wisdom to be found within the superhero genre, brought to you by James Prescott. That is what this is.
Awesome. That's what it is. Yeah. And we've done Batman and Superman in the last two episodes. Mm-hmm. This week we're going to move to a different universe, the Marvel universe. There's so many characters in the Marvel universe we could look at, but the two we're going to look at today, and there's a reason we're looking at these two, is Loki, and in particular his TV show, which was last year. I did an episode on the Loki TV series last year, but we're going to explore a specific thing in relation to that, and WandaVision, which came out in the same year as Loki.
And I will say about WandaVision, I've never been tagged on something quite so much on Twitter as WandaVision when the episode came out and there was that brilliant quote about grief.
Yes.
What is it? What is grief if not love?
Persevering. Yeah.
Persevering. Yes. And so everyone was like, well, obviously, I think that was just when my book about grief, A Hole in the World, was being published. And so everyone was like, you have got to watch this TV show because of the way it deals with grief. And as a rule, I don't like to blame my children for kind of just like being an irresponsible human in the world. But anyone who has kids the age of 2 and 4 know that committing to watching a new television series when you have kids that age is quite the ask.
Oh, yeah.
But by the time they get in bed, we are really lucky to watch a 20-minute segment of American Idol before we fall asleep. And so, again, this is me preparing for some future date in which I will have free time again in the evenings to watch a show like WandaVision, which again, I'm very excited about because I've heard such good things.
Yeah. And most people who are listening probably have seen these shows. So there will be spoilers for these shows, for their characters' stories, by the way, if you've not seen them. So this episode will contain spoilers.
The good thing for me is that I have very short-term memory. Like I have a hard time remembering details when it comes to plot lines. So even if you give a spoiler alert, I'll probably be okay when I watch it. Also, I once heard a friend, Justin Lonis. He said, "Oh, you can find him on Twitter too, Justin Lonis." J.R. Lonis writes, I believe. He said that great fiction or great storytelling, spoilers are not possible because you could tell the details of what happens at the end, but the
Yeah,
story and the character development
absolutely.
is so brilliant, it's so beautiful that it doesn't even matter that you know the punchline at the end. So
Yeah, I would agree with that.
don't worry about the spoilers, James.
Yeah. Well, the background. I mean, the background of the two characters is probably the best place to start, right? So Loki is the brother of Thor, the adopted brother of Thor, um, and he's the god of mischief.
Yes, he's a sinister character, right? Like this is
Yeah,
what I.
yeah, and he was taken away from his birth family in a war. He was brought up by Thor's father, Thor's parents. Basically, they were basically his parents. Always felt inferior to Thor. Always felt that he was like not the kind of Thor was like the special one, the chosen child. You know, he was overlooked and ignored or whatever. He always had this inferiority complex basically with Thor, um, and but yet felt that it was his kind of right to rule, right? Um, that somehow he was entitled to rule, like didn't see ruling as a responsibility but as a right. Um,
Was he, did you say younger brother or older
younger,
brother?
younger, yeah,
Oh, that's a whole,
yeah,
that is a whole conversation.
yeah, exactly, right. That's
The younger sibling kind of mentality.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So in the first Thor movie, he tries to take over um, Isengard, which is where they're from, and fails and ends up being kind of banished to Earth almost at the end of that movie. And then, of course, there's the first Avengers movie where he is the primary villain and he's trying to take over the world, basically, and brings this intergalactic army with him to try and do it, and gets defeated. Now, this is where you have to jump to Endgame because in the first Avengers movie, he gets taken back to be punished on Thor's homeworld, right? But at the Endgame, that timeline was distorted, and he ends up getting this thing called the cube. It's kind of made from an infinity stone, and just transporting himself to another dimension, which creates a whole different timeline, which is where we get the Loki TV show. In the other timeline, his mother dies, his father dies, and he ends up sacrificing himself actually to help save the universe, which is one timeline. But this is a whole different timeline. That's where Loki picks up is when he's just transported himself to this alternate dimension, and he's picked up by these police who govern different people's timelines, and if they're out of sync with their timeline, which is called the sacred timeline, then they can get arrested and put in this kind of time prison, which is where he's taken. So that's the show. That's where Loki is at the start of his show. Wanda is she lost her parents very young. She was a twin. So her and her twin brother were experimented on and given superpowers. And one of her power was kind of manipulating minds, manipulating like physical stuff, like moving stuff with her mind, so she got all these powers. And she was kind of locked up and experimented on, basically, right? And then, like in the second Avengers movie, her and her brother escape and try to help the Avengers, and her brother gets killed. So she's now lost her brother and her parents, right?
Gotcha.
And then she, what happens then? She takes sides with Captain America in Civil War, which ends up, with her kind of being like becoming a fugitive a little bit, and then yeah, she falls in love with Vision, um, and they kind of go and hide away in Scotland, on a kind of almost on the run a little bit, but just hiding away and building a life together.
Gotcha.
And then
What is Vision's power?
Vision was created by an Infinity Stone out of a computer consciousness, like Jarvis, which is the kind of AI that Tony Stark creates to run his house. And you combine this with an Infinity Stone, and they grew this body in this chamber, and he becomes Vision, basically.
Gotcha.
And he's very powerful, can move through anything, can fly, can fire things out of his head, and he's kind of a seeker of peace, basically. Like he's non-violent. He's very calm and rational, and like a good guy, really, but with a lot of power. And so she runs off. They're kind of both outsiders, which is why they fall in love with each other, really. And then Avengers, Infinity War, and Endgame happen, and at the end of Infinity War, Vision sacrifices himself, basically. In fact, he actually asks her to kill him because Thanos wants the Infinity Stone because he wants to take over the universe and kill half the universe. He says, "It's better you kill me and take this and destroy this stone than him destroy half the universe." So she does it, and then, but Thanos comes and has the time stone, so he winds back time and then takes it out of his head, takes the stone out of his head and kills him anyway.
Oh,
right. So she loses him. So she's lost everybody that she's loved. Everyone.
Wow.
She lost her parents. She lost her brother, and then she lost her partner. So she's lost everybody. She's been through a lot of grief, right? And then and that's kind of where you leave her, and then that's where WandaVision picks up, is a few months down the road from that, and she's living in this village, which is almost like a 1950s village, like a 1950s idealistic, like typical, kind of the kind of place that they used to display on TV shows, where everyone's got a nice house and a nice car, and it's 2.4 children and married couples, and it's actually presented like a 50s TV show in the first couple of episodes.
Yes, that is what it kind of intrigues me about this particular series, is that it has this kind of motif of like 1950s Ozzie and Harriet, Leave It to Beaver TV show, like almost I don't know if you've seen The Truman Show.
Yes,
where
I love
it's
that
kind
movie.
of falsely constructed idyllic world, or idyllic by 1950s standards. But that's kind of the look that is.
Yeah, and that's ironic that you mentioned The Truman Show, because what it obviously turns out to be is that she's taken Vision's body, and manufactured. She's gone into this real village at this plot of land that Vision had bought for them to build a house on, and there's this really powerful scene where she just kneels down on the ground and screams, and it's like this raw grief. But because she's powerful, it unleashes all this power inside of her, and it almost manufactures this idyllic village, which she is in control of. Right?
Very interesting.
So she creates this world with these children, which are not her real children, but are her children, and Vision, who is still alive, living this idyllic life in this village, but it's not real.
Okay, so tell me about this then. Like, what is this trying to communicate about our post-catastrophic event, post-catastrophic loss, how we cope? That's so interesting. I mean, when you talk about her screaming in this kind of raw grief moment, I mean, you and I've talked about Irish keening before, the keen being this kind of unleashed, kind of primal wail of
Yeah, it's
sorrow.
like that. Yeah, it's very much like that.
Yeah, they made space for it in Ireland in the olden days. They actually set aside a time for everyone to scream like this. But it's so interesting that it is from that scream that this kind of world. I don't know. Is it escapism? Is it the death of what
Yeah, I mean,
she hoped?
it gets to the point where she doesn't even know that she's created it. She doesn't know to start with. She doesn't realize, or maybe she sort of thinks she does, but is choosing to ignore it. You know, she doesn't want to. She doesn't want to. She doesn't want to know. It's not real. So she almost forgets. But what happens in the show is there's a series of circumstances where Vision and even her start to question what is this place? There's something about this place that's not quite right. And of course, it starts to come to light what's really going on. And then you see that you also, interestingly, in the show, you see the perspective of the people outside the village because they can see what's really happening. They can see this whole load of energy that's covering this village and projecting this alternate reality, right? And but you can only see that from the outside. You can't see that when you're in
Wow.
it, which is another great metaphor actually, because when you're dealing with grief, sometimes you can't see how that's coming across, or what like how other people are seeing you, or how other people are perceiving it, because you're so in it.
Yes. Yes. Oh wow, that's so true. You're so much a part of it. You can't see it clearly.
Yeah, exactly, right. Especially when you've let the grief control you rather than actually doing the work of grief.
Right.
Um,
Wow.
and what actually happens is there's this character called I've forgotten her name now. There's this witch anyway. I've forgotten her name. My mind's gone completely blank, and I should know it. Agatha.
Ah,
That's where that meme comes from. It was Agatha all along, right?
yes.
But what actually she does is force Wanda to confront reality. So she takes her on this almost like this tour of her life and all the places that meant something to her, and she's actually forced to confront her grief.
Wow.
And Agatha's not meant to be the hero at all. She's kind of a villain, but she forces Wanda to face up to all of this, and that's why we have this scene with Vision, where they're sitting in their bedroom talking, and they're talking about grief, and he says that line, "What is grief but love
Yeah.
persevering?" And
Yeah.
it's quite an emotional scene. It's like I've had IFS therapy, and it's kind of like it felt kind of like a real life version of that, where you're going to different scenes from your life and reliving them from the
Yes.
perspective of you now and
Yeah.
doing work on them. It was kind of like that, and that's what happens with Wanda. And she realizes what's going on, and that
Yeah.
she's creating this world, and she knows deep down that she's got to stop this, like, because she's harming people and she's controlling people without their consent. And
Well, and it kind of reminds me a little bit. I don't know if the acronym EMDR
yes,
means anything to
yes,
you. Yeah,
absolutely,
that's
yeah,
like a trained licensed therapist, kind of after you've done some kind of preparatory work to build up some of your coping and resilience skills. A trained therapist can work with you to kind of call up in a little bit more of a visceral way some of the trauma or the loss you've experienced, so that you do to a degree relive the memories, and then your brain, again, this is why the person needs training and then licensing, but they work with you to get your brain to kind of process it in a way where it's not stuck. Your body doesn't get stuck in those
yeah.
feelings anymore. But anyway, I'm like, does Agatha represent a trained, licensed therapist? But it sounds like she's a little bit of a not necessarily a protagonist, but maybe a villain, has some villain undertones to her.
Yeah, and that's right. What she's doing is trying to help Wanda discover who she really is, which is a witch.
Yeah.
Right,
Ah.
which is, and that she's always been a witch, and that the superpowers that she has just added to that. They weren't. That's not because she had. It's not because she had superpowers that she's a witch. She was already a witch. And of course, what happens is, as we both know, when you start processing your grief and working it through and doing healing, you start to discover yourself a bit. You start to become more embodied, and realize who you are. And that's actually what happens to Wanda. Right? So she becomes more powerful, she becomes more confident, she realizes what she has to do and that she has to let go of this space and the past and these children that are not hers. And so she does. But the one person she traps in this fake reality is Agatha. She keeps her trapped in this
Okay.
fake reality, which shows that she's not completely healed yet.
Yeah.
And actually, what happens is there's a after WandaVision, there's a movie, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, where she is essentially the villain.
Mm.
And what she is doing, she is going to every timeline in the multiverse, and she's trying to find one where she actually had children, and wants to take those children and bring them up as her own.
Oh, interesting.
So she's kind of gone to this dark place. Like she's kind of come into her power, but actually is now still hasn't grieved properly. I think she's grieving is the loss of her children at this point, because she kind of lost her children at the end of WandaVision, right?
I see.
And and it's kind of a tragic story, and she ended up realizing what she was doing, and stops it, but sacrificing herself. So it's kind of a tragic story of like where her grief gets the better of her, really. But it wasn't a great movie, and it wasn't brilliantly written. Unfortunately, it wasn't the story that I thought it should have been for her. But WandaVision is a really great story of what happens when we don't deal with our grief well, basically.
Sure. Yeah.
Because it can end up controlling other people, it can end up causing harm to other people, it can hurt people. It's a real thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that shows an example of it, really. And
And when there's that suspension from reality, we aren't able to perceive where and how we're hurting other people
yeah,
because we're so trapped in our own world of grief.
exactly. Yeah, this show is definitely an example of that. Reminded me of how toxic religion can be like that as well. Like
Mm.
toxic religion can
Yeah.
be a place where you hide from dealing with your grief, right?
Oh, so
Yeah.
unpack that a little bit and what makes you think that?
Well, I was part of it
Because
for a while,
so
and it's like, and by the way, I'm not having a go at healthy expressions of religion and spirituality at all.
totally, but
But
this idea of spiritual bypassing,
yeah,
right?
it's
Like,
like when you go to church and you're told to, like, maybe therapy is bad, don't do therapy. God can heal everything. Just have prayer ministry. Just give it to God, and then it's going to be okay. And I've actually had friends who've lost loved ones and who have done this, right? And then they think, oh, everything's okay now, and they act like everything is
right.
okay, and they act like everything's better, and they say everything's better. And
Yes, yes.
and I was there and saw this, and I thought, no, it's not. It's not better. You just think it is. Because I know, because I've been there, right? I even
Yeah,
got sucked into that for a while myself, thinking it was all okay. I thought I'd dealt with my grief, but I hadn't dealt with it. I just buried it under some religious certainty, and
right.
that's
Right. Well, even what frustrates me is when the story we have stories of redemption within faith, and those are vital, those are necessary. But when that story then is made to swallow the story of pain or to erase the story of pain, say we're going to erase your pain with victory. We're going to erase your loss with positive, optimistic spiritual language or spiritual platitudes. What I love to see is when the story of hope exists alongside the story of pain, and they coexist, and they are both true, and we live in the tension of it. It's that when you step into a funeral service in a church that's just called a celebration of life, and I don't want to other people can call the funerals of their loved ones whatever they want, but I really prefer to call it a funeral, because it's like this is not a celebration, this is mourning, this is grieving, this is loss, and we can't write over that with a different name and put spiritual language to it to write over that.
Absolutely. I think that's right. And certainly when I pass away, I'm going to make sure that I might even put things in place to make sure that people have an opportunity to grieve properly, rather than just move on and pretend nothing's bad has happened. Because it's important to acknowledge what has happened and to sit in that and feel that and understand it, and because otherwise you'll never deal with it properly. So that's what I saw, when I watched that show, especially it being 1950s America, kind of where all of that kind of was like really, really kind of the norm almost. So and where that kind of movement really took off. Kind of definitely got vibes for that when I watched that show. So
that's an interesting parallel for sure.
And the contrast with Loki, because it's important. I would recommend everyone watch the first Thor movie and the first Avengers movie before they watch the Loki show, and watch the Loki show directly after the first Avengers movie, because that's when in his timeline, that's when it happens. And so he starts off with this kind of villainous, duplicitous, narcissistic, egotistical villain, really. He wants to control everything, who deceives people, who manipulates people, who doesn't tell the truth all the time. It just sounds scarily familiar, doesn't it? But what happens is, again, that when he's in this place which is kind of outside of time, where you can see all the different timelines. He's sat in a room with this guy, this kind of agent, and basically what they do is they play his whole life on a screen in front of him, what has happened and what will happen, and he has to watch it. And it's quite a powerful moment when he has to watch his whole life in front of him, and he has a conversation, because this guy, this agent that's working with him, knows everything about him, knows his whole life, knows all his tricks, knows everything that he'll try and do, knows literally almost more than he does about him. And so he can't get anything by him, right? So and so he's forced to confront all of this stuff. He's forced to confront the future death of his mother. He's forced to confront his childhood. He's forced to actually start talking about this stuff. It's almost like therapy, and of course this does something to him, obviously. And what ends up happening is he ends up meeting different versions of himself, different variants of himself from different timelines, including a female version of himself.
So not the parallel, I guess, then it seems like with WandaVision is this forced confrontation with the bosses or with the true self, or
absolutely. But his response is very different. I think it's because something happens to him over the whole show, and his character changes completely. It's almost being forced to face up to who he is and what has happened to him, and how that made him feel, and then seeing other versions of himself.
Yeah.
and it all does something to him. And it's actually quite funny because he goes to this world where there's all these different variants of himself, like an old version of himself, a crocodile version of himself, a child version of himself, like all these different variants of himself. And like I said, a female version of himself as well. He's like one of the lead female in the series is a female version of him, which is really interesting dynamic. Like, because they kind of almost fall in love with each other. So through this process, and it's difficult to explain like six episodes, in a few minutes. But at the end, in the last episode of the series, he meets Kang, right? Who's meant to be the next big Marvel villain. So Kang is like this guy that has power over all the timelines, every timeline. He's just sitting in his castle overseeing all these timelines. And they're going to try and destroy him before he unleashes all these different multiverses and lets them interact with each other and things get out of control. And so the sacred timeline is disrupted by all these other timelines. They're trying to stop this, right? So, and he offers Loki power over the whole of time. He just offers it to him. And
interesting.
This is Loki who has spent 2 movies trying to take over the world and trying to take over his home world, craving power, thinking that will solve all his problems. And he's offered this even more powerful position, and he just turned it down without thinking about it. It's
so why is that?
So he turned it down because it's almost like he doesn't need it anymore. It's because and it's not a surprise when he turns it down either, because you've seen what this journey he's been on and who he's become, and he's almost trying to do the right thing. He's trying to help people, and it's like he's almost realized what he was and how unhealthy what he was doing was. Yeah. And then he has to try to stop the other variant of himself from trying to take the power.
Yeah.
Which is really ironic. It's like, given where he came from. And at the end, the variant of himself unleashes all these alternate timelines, and he goes back to this place where he had all this therapy, I suppose, and met all these agents, and it's almost like it's changed completely, and they don't remember him.
Yeah, yeah.
And he's the only one that knows what's really going on.
Right.
And he's sitting, and there's this shot. I posted it on Instagram at the time. There's this shot of him, and he's sitting there, and he's worn down, and his face is so heavy, and it looks aged by grief. He looks weighed down by this heaviness of what is happening and all this stuff that he's been processing, and all that he knows the reality of everything that's really happening, and is burdened by it almost. Like there's this kind of, it's like he's weighed down by grief. And you can see that he's done the work. You can see that he's, that the veil has kind of been lifted off him, and he's just like bearing the weight of everything that's happened.
Yeah.
And it's such a powerful moment. I'll have to share the photo with you Amanda when we finish recording. But it's such a powerful moment, because it's like how did you have to go back and watch the Avengers movie again and think, wait a minute, he was like this 6 episodes ago, and now he's not even the same person anymore. He's like completely changed and matured and like healed, and like he's feeling all of this grief. He's got it in his body. It's all there, and it's and he's been transformed by it. By actually engaging with his grief, he's been transformed.
Right. Yeah.
He's a completely different person. Kind of that lightness that he always had, and that ego that he always had, it's kind of disappeared, because he's now actually feeling everything that he's had to process. And now he's
Right.
carrying something even more because he's carrying a weight that nobody else in the world that he's in is actually aware of.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there's kind of it's so powerful. Yeah.
Not hiding from it anymore.
Yeah. Because I resonated with that. I resonated with how it feels to carry that weight around with you.
Yeah.
When other people
Sure.
are not carrying that weight.
Yes, and you feel so isolated and alone in that burden.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So what are your questions, thoughts?
Oh my goodness. Well, I mean, I think maybe why do you think well, I mean, why do you think these two stories resonated so much with people? Because I saw so much positive, like, conversation and chatter about it on Twitter. People saying what compelling storytelling it was, how well done. So besides maybe just kind of maybe the artistry of the filming or the storytelling, like what is it? What's the deeper thing that you think people are resonating with these two stories?
I think it's interesting at the timing they came out. I think they came out in 2021.
So
I
we're
think it was
all in a COVID world. That's right. Yeah,
we're in the pandemic. So and so I think people were carrying a lot of grief.
sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
people are always carrying a lot of grief, but in particular, there was this collective grieving of the life that we'd had, and some people were not dealing with it and trying to hide from it, with conspiracy theories and
Yeah.
all this kind of
Yeah.
thing that people use to hide from reality. And some people were actively dealing with it and processing it, and some people were going through genuine transformation, and
Yeah.
so these two shows for me like captured almost the two responses that we can have to trauma and grief, that, and certainly from my perspective, I saw elements of my journey in both of them because I'd been that person who had hidden away and like tried to and thought I'd dealt with it and hadn't. And I'd
Yeah.
also
Right.
been the person who had ended up having to face up to all of it and felt that weightiness and that heaviness and that transformation, and discovering myself, my true self. Like I'd seen that as well. So it was, and I think people resonated with, especially with Loki, with that heaviness that he was carrying. Like, because everyone was feeling a lot of that at the time. It was, and probably still are. And of course, Tom Hiddleston is such a good actor as well. Like he's very good at conveying those emotions, and like he's very good at he's just a very good actor. And so
Yeah.
is the person who played Elizabeth Olsen, who played Wanda. She's a very good actress as well. So they both conveyed these emotions really authentically, and you could empathize and connect with them, and or at least understand them if you couldn't empathize with them.
Right.
It was believable. It was powerful, and I mean, I especially connected with Loki. That I'll never forget that shot. I've got it in my head right now in the last episode. It's just so. It's just it just you just it's just I can't communicate it really. It's just so powerful. Like this kind of it's all etched over his face, and he's not slick and just smooth and all like dressed presented really well like he was in the earlier movies, but he's kind of a bit of a mess and like looks worn down by everything. And I just resonated with that so much. And like I said, I posted an Instagram post about it because I felt it so deeply that it was just something I had to share. And it's just like facing up to grief and dealing with your trauma and actually doing the work is not easy. That's what that communicated. It's not easy, but it is necessary. Like
Yeah.
for real healing and for transformation and being your authentic self, you need to do that work because otherwise you'll just carry it around with you and it will control you. I mean, ironically, it controlled Loki for a long
Yeah.
time. Like his quest for power was really a quest for a way to numb his pain,
Yeah.
to avoid dealing with his pain, to just control everything If I control everything, then I can't be hurt anymore.
Right.
And I can resonate with that. Like, I had moments where I had, like, trauma meltdowns where I was just like, I just wish I could control everything because then I wouldn't get hurt. Like, I understand that impulse. It's a common impulse from
Yeah.
people, like when they respond to trauma, is to try and control things so that they can't get hurt anymore. And that was his trauma response. And once he dealt with the trauma, that wasn't there anymore. That need to control everything was gone, which you see at the end of the last episode, where he turns down the chance to kind of rule time, and just says, no, we can't do this. This is not responsible. We can't let this happen, kind of thing. Which is like,
Yeah.
this is Loki saying this, because it's totally different from the character that you've got to know.
Yeah.
And but it's believable. It's completely believable. It doesn't feel rushed at all. It feels really authentic.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, just talking it now and thinking about how much it resonated with people during the particular season we were in, is that I am wondering if kind of um, COVID acted as kind of a lens by which we all had to confront our past griefs, a lens by which we had to confront our the precariousness by which we live our lives, our fragility, how, really everything in some ways is a house of cards. We have all these illusions of control in 21st century privileged UK, privileged America. But there's something about COVID that to me forced me to kind of deal with the reality of no, things actually are out of my control. Things actually are quite fragile. And these are all the things that have happened in my life that were out of control, out of my control, and were an example of my fragility. And that's sometimes why I think we are all coming out of COVID feeling still a bit rattled and tired and exhausted and mean is because we've all been on this tour of our own um, limits. It's like a tour of our fragility during COVID.
Hmm.
And that's why this series was so powerful for people at that time.
I agree. I absolutely agree. Yeah. Yeah, connected with something deep inside people, and whether they realized it or not. um, yeah, and I remember when the pandemic started, I remember going shopping, walking down the street to the shop, and saying things are never going to be the same. It's not going to be the same ever again. And people don't realize this right now, and they don't understand this right now. But I just felt intuitively like, and I did
Sure.
feel even then that it would be a good opportunity for us to finally confront our grief culturally and individually, like, and historically, like we could finally, if we chose to do that. And at the start, I was hopeful that we would, but and maybe, and I think some people have. Some people
Yeah.
certainly have, and I think the number of people that are deconstructing now, like, it's becoming a bigger thing. I
Yeah.
think COVID is definitely partly responsible for that. I think Trump is partly responsible for that as well. But I think COVID and lockdown in particular was this kind of chance to reflect. And even for me, I know that I started properly having real therapy around the time lockdown started. I
Yeah.
started doing embodiment work with an embodiment coach around the time lockdown started. So I was doing all that work, and I was having time to reflect on it properly,
Yeah.
and so it really sped up my healing, I think, and it sped up my transformation and connection to myself, because I was having so much more time with myself while I was doing all this work on myself.
Yeah. Well, and I guess I worry because I feel like some people did that. Some people really did the work. It just doesn't feel like we maybe collectively did,
Mm, I agree.
because I don't know why that is. I don't know why it wasn't kind of I don't know, like, how did the forces of good win over the forces of evil, James? Like, we'll never answer that question, but it just felt like our this is always kind of like our better angels didn't seem to win the day on this one, at least not in the US. It felt like it just, for about 3 weeks, we were all kind of together in our shared mortality and fragility and cheering on the heroes and willing to make sacrifices. And after about four 3 to 4 weeks, that was the end of that, and individualism and
Yeah.
the desire for productivity and the desire to control took the day,
Yeah.
you know?
It was about 2 months, 3 months here. We were doing this thing called clapping nurses every Thursday
Yeah.
during
Oh, yeah, I
lockdown.
know. I saw.
And it
Uh-huh.
was, I felt really, at the time, it was really positive. Everyone was together. Everyone was like united. Everyone was behind the NHS. Everyone was like, this is a crisis. We have to make sacrifices, and let's appreciate the people that are doing all the work and everything like that. And it was really good. And it just faded out. It just faded out. And this government who told us to cut the nurses and now has been cutting their pay, has been cutting the spending on the health service, has been cutting, giving health contracts to rich friends with no experience in healthcare, and it kind of feels that the government's words were kind of empty. But I think that at the time, people were really genuinely grateful
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
people were together. And I thought, if we could just do this all the time and have this
Yeah.
sense of community and togetherness and supporting each other, and facing up to what's really happening in the world, the
Yeah.
world will be better. The world will be better. We might have to deal with a few difficult things in the short term, but in the long term, the world will be better. And I
Yeah.
wanted to believe that would happen, but obviously it didn't happen. Um, and
Well,
that's really sad. Yeah.
yeah. And I'll bring it back around to the topic at hand. These superhero, these universes, these kind of modern mythologies that we tell. It feels like right now people are comprehending and engaging at the pace of Twitter, at the word length of Twitter, these snippets of kind of
Mm,
sound bites of rage and sound. Like you can't have a proper processing of differences
mm,
with a character limit like we have on Twitter, and even just the kind of the time frame in which social media works, not to mention the algorithm that's manipulating the conversation. But I think what the role that these stories play, and this is why I think mythology has always played such a huge role, storytelling, mythology within cultures across time and cultures across generations, and is that a story forces you to slow down and inhabit meaning, inhabit deeper truths. And so, maybe, I mean, this is, I don't know, no one from Disney Plus or anywhere is paying me to say this, but perhaps if everyone had slowed down and watched WandaVision or something,
mm,
we inhabited our pain in a way that was more, I don't know, imaginative, curious, embody. I don't know, but instead, it's just like we're looking for these quick fixes, of like these like rage hits on
yeah.
Twitter
Yeah.
to affirm the darkest parts of ourselves. And so I think, yeah, story is so important because it allows ourselves to separate. We are separated from our own story and our own emotions and introduced to someone who's like us, someone who maybe we aspire to be, someone who has lived a story similar to ours. And so we can be a little bit objective, and then we can watch and follow and see
Mm,
and learn and grow from their story. And it feels less confrontational, it feels less accusatory, and yet it is us. It is looking in a mirror.
mm,
It is
yeah.
it is examining our own lives. And that's why I think, that's why, yeah, storytelling, mythology, folklore, these things are so important, and
Yeah.
have like, why do we have storytelling? Why has every culture across every generation has storytelling? And I think it's because of this, and we're changing the way we tell stories a little bit, but
Mm.
there's a for it.
You're right, and it is sad about Twitter and the algorithm. I mean, when we thought Twitter was disappearing for good, I started using some other social media things, Mastodon in particular. And what I noticed in that period was like the algorithm here is completely different. There's no one who's outraged. There's no one who's angry. There's no rage tweeting. There's no subtweeting. It's just the algorithm is completely different. And I realized at that point, and I kind of already knew, but this kind of brought it into focus, was that the algorithm of Twitter is basically, we will find things and direct things to you that will make you angry so that you can rage tweet about them and get loads, and everyone can rage tweet about them and everyone can subtweet about them, and then the more people use the platform and
Yep.
get more engagement and you get more followers, and
Yeah.
you get psychologically addicted to this and start thinking it's normal, and
Yeah.
it's
I
not
love.
normal, and it's like, and like you say, it doesn't allow us space to process the deeper emotions that we're experiencing, and
Yeah.
and that's why I block a lot of accounts now, and I just don't respond when I see people responding to all these things that come out and getting angry about everything, and I'm like, look, I'm angry at injustice whenever injustice happens,
Yeah.
period. But
Yeah.
I'm not going to rage tweet about it to prove that. I don't have to get angry at every little thing that to prove that. I'm angry about gun violence. I'm angry about other things in the world that are just not right. But I'm not going to just go on and on and on about it on Twitter and just lose myself in there, which doesn't achieve anything. Even all it does is satisfy my anger,
Right.
right? And
Right.
that's not healthy, I don't think. You know, um, and so you're right about that. And the other thing I realized actually is that, like, with storytelling and modern mythology, you know, we need more stories of hope. We need more. We need more characters that say, yes, the world is not a perfect place, and there's injustice and there's suffering, and that's wrong. But also that we can do that, that a better world is possible. That we
Yes.
can make it. That we can make the world better. That we can do something positive to change that. Like, and this is why I love Superman, because this is what Superman is all about.
Right.
And I remember the first Superman movie in 1978 came in that period in American history where you just had Watergate and you'd had the Vietnam War and you were coming out of all of that. And it was, people were looking for hope, even though they didn't realize they were. And
Right.
and that's when Jimmy Carter came and kind of offered that hope. And Star Wars was kind of this hopeful story, right? And Superman was a hopeful movie, right? And people bought into it because they were desperate for it, even though they didn't realize they were desperate for it. And I think the same might be true now, which is why I'm really excited that there's going to be a Superman movie in a couple of years, because there aren't many hopeful superheroes. A lot of
Yeah.
superheroes are just kind of, this is the world as it is, and we're going to try and make it better. So,
Yeah.
Superman is one of, along with Captain America, Superman is one of those heroes that says, no, actually, I believe the world can be good, and that people can be good, and that we can make things better if we work together. And there is something worth believing in, you know,
Yeah.
and we don't always have to be cynical. And I think we need those stories, and that's that's why I'm really glad that Superman's coming into the world in the movie. That they've got this movie coming out, because we need stories like that.
Yeah. Like we need, and that's what perhaps why they're called superheroes, is that we need people that can transcend what we can even do, but kind of show us the way,
Yeah,
and show what could be and how the world could be.
absolutely, absolutely. Well, this has been a really great little mini series. I'd love to do more of this. There's so many characters we could talk about.
Well, yeah, and I feel bad for you. You've had well, maybe, I don't know. I guess that's sometimes how things work best, is when one person comes in with no background on it and gets educated and gets to ask questions. But for your sake, I hope that you can find people that are more educated than I am to have the conversation.
No, but it's been good. It's actually been good for me to share it with you, because I love sharing it with people. I love introducing people to these stories, because they've been so beneficial for me and healing for me, and I feel like they
Yeah,
can be healing for other people as well. For all the reasons that we've talked about, and you can find yourself in these stories. You can find hope in these stories. You can find solidarity.
yeah,
And clarity sometimes. So yeah, this has been great. And I'm sure we'll do more episodes together. In fact, I know we will. And I'm sure I'll do more episodes on this kind of theme as well, with these kind of characters. So Thanks for being my guest.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks for listening, everybody.